Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day. That is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Please be aware that this episode contains graphic content around themes of sexual violence, sex, misogyny and pornography that some people may find upsetting. Jocelyn Anderson is CEO of West Mercia Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre, and she is also the NCPS Ambassador for survivors of rape and sexual violence. When we spoke, we jumped straight into what was a sometimes challenging conversation, exploring the many barriers that are faced by those who work in this area and, of course, by those they support. From stigma and ignorance to long, arduous fights for justice and for funding, Jocelyn doesn't hold back from describing the reality of the situation. And it's quite right that she doesn't. It's this that makes her such a fierce advocate for victim survivors, as well as for smaller community-based services that offer them support. And you'll hear at one point a short pause, which is where I'm struggling to find the right word to describe a child that abuses another. And I clumsily land on the word perpetrator. As soon as it left my lips, I could hear and feel how wrong it sounded. But I chose not to edit that out because I hope that my mistake, as a natural part of this conversation, demonstrates just how difficult it can be when subjects remain so taboo to know and find the right words, even for those of us working in this profession. Jocelyn says sexual violence is still in the too difficult box, and people don't want to acknowledge it. Do you feel that things are changing? I'm just thinking of so much stuff that you're sort of hearing going, the mandatory reporting coming in, things like that. Does it feel like things are changing in your world, in the world you work in at the moment?
Yes, but on many, many fronts.
Okay, so not all positive?
No, very few positives, in fairness.
Jocelyn.
The funding is obviously which has hit everybody, the increase in national insurance. We're in a process, we have to make redundancies. We've had cuts in funding, even little pots where we used to get funding from. I think competition for funding is a lot more difficult than it has been. There is more publicity around sexual violence in all of its forms. And we find that against a backdrop of less money, we are having more and more referrals, and we're just watching waiting lists grow. There is a move with commissioners, I feel, particularly NHS commissioners, not that they actually give us any money, but they are moving away from one-to-one work and towards more group work, which is really positive for some people. But it's not one size fits all.
Of course.
And I think that there should always be a place for one-to-one. And I think something as intimate and traumatic as sexual violence, you need to be able to sit with one person. I mean, group work can be brilliant. There is that element of, are people in the group going to traumatise others? When you start, you see sometimes the groups, and it's a 2-hour programme. But then the staff team are there for another hour after because somebody's been triggered, there's been an incident, there's been something. And One of the exercises I used to do with the police when I was doing the training is that I'd give them all a little envelope and a piece of paper and say, I'd like you to write down your last sexual experience and put it in, proper descriptive terms. So no little fuzzy words to describe anything, proper anatomically correct words. And then I'd say, and then we're going to read one out and I will pick it at random. And you could feel the tension in the room. And people will either start writing and be compliant, or they will object quite strongly, or people will just try and pick something funny. And the responses are really good. So we'd never go through with the exercise. But it's that idea of, if you are asking somebody, a rape victim, about what's happened to them, and you can't talk about your last sexual experience, and again, you don't know what that might be.
Yeah.
How easy do you think it is for somebody who's been raped to have that conversation with you? What, when you're asking questions and you're making a statement, how easy do you think it would be for you? And I sit on a police scrutiny panel, and we were saying, because we've noticed a real drop in clients in the counselling service reporting to the police. So the advocacy service, the advocacy service, most of their referrals come from the police. So that's sort of like a false positive. But the counselling service, less and less people seem to be engaging with the police. And when you look that you might have, we've got clients that have been waiting 8 years for a case to come to court. But when I first started, it was 18 months to 2 years. But, you're looking at 5 years now. Are you going to put your life on hold for that period of time? Is it going to be, it's unrealistic. And we were sat, I don't know why people keep inviting me to meetings, because I'm sure that I just, they regret it afterwards.
Do you ruffle feathers?
I think I'm just very honest or straightforward or blunt, depending on the words. But it was a meeting of police officers, and I said, well, I prepared all my stats and done everything. And I just sat there and I said, knowing what you know about the criminal justice process, if you were raped by a colleague, would you report it? And you could just see this giant penny dropping. And if, and a couple of them, and you can always have a conversation about it. Well, if it was me, I definitely would. What if it was your child? Would you put them through this, knowing what you know about it, knowing the investigative process, knowing the criminal justice process, knowing how long it takes, knowing the questions that they're going to be asked? Would you do it? And one of the police officers that we work with, she is absolutely brilliant. And she said, I just sat there and I put my head in my hands and I just wanted to cry, because I thought, what are we actually asking people to do? And when you put it in terms that hits for people, I think it causes reflection on a different level.
Yeah.
And it was that thing of, if you're a police officer and you haven't got confidence in the system, why would anybody else?
Of course.
So there's those elements going on. And you mentioned mandatory reporting. Mm-hmm. I think that's quite a worry. It depends on the parameters. Any agency worth its salt should safeguard children. Always have a really good safeguarding policy and process, and we do that. But depending on the parameters of it, which I think is going to be interesting, if we have to report an adult who was sexually abused as a child, where is their autonomy? And there's that balance of risk again. So we have a periodically, every time there's a new local authority safeguarding person, and we have the same sort of conversation, is that there are fast time safeguarding and slow time. So if a child is on their way home from school and they contact and say, I'm going to my father's and he abuses me, you do something immediately. If it's a child saying, I've been sexually abused by my granddad and he's dead, it's a different response. And what always worries me is where there are blanket policies, and I think sexual violence still scares people. It's difficult to see how it's going to rage on, and I would be really concerned if there is anything that prevents, anything that puts another barrier into people accessing support.
Yeah.
And, and local authority, what are local authorities going to do? So we've had conversations in the past about, you have to tell us all of the children who are in your service because it's safeguarding. And we have the conversation about different circumstances, this, that, and the other, and that it's an appropriate response to that child. And I said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we'll write them a letter. And, how is that a benefit to the client? So there's different elements. There are rape crisis centres closing around the country. Stoke has just closed. It just seems to be the voluntary sector is taking a hammering, particularly in sexual violence, because we have no KPIs, there's nothing that enforces councils or NHS to fund services.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, and I know this is probably not the best view, but I think the fact that we exist at all is a failure of our society, because all of the services that we should provide should be provided seamlessly by local authorities, health, any of those organisations. It shouldn't come down to the voluntary sector and postcode lotteries around the country. It should be a right that if you have been sexually abused, assaulted, harassed in any way, that you get immediate support. And it's not happening.
It's always been, since I've known you, and we'll look back a little bit and how you got into this work and how it is that you're a friend of the societies. But since I've known you, you've always been very clear just how hard, how much you're swimming against the tide, how much there's constant firefighting, and to run with that analogy, that metaphor, with little equipment provided to do so. And it sounds from what you're saying that it's feeling harder as time goes on. Yeah.
And I do wonder if it's just because I'm getting older, I'm more bitter and twisted. But when you look around the sector and you have conversations and centres are closing,
yeah,
we took a 47% cut in funding from the Ministry of Justice. And you just think, well, how do we get that back?
Mm-hmm.
One of our contracts has had no increase in 4 years. But they want more referrals, they want more work for it. And you're just thinking, well, I think sometimes the voluntary sector is held to higher standards, if that makes sense. It's how are you going to do this? How are you going to scrutinise it? Well, we scrutinise everything because we have to. It's a legal obligation. But I sometimes look at some of the larger organisations and just think, you have no idea what busy is. You have no idea what. And I think their clients are perhaps faceless, whereas ours are, we work locally, we have connections, we often have members of the same family. I remember working on one case where we had 5 members of the same family, none of whom knew that they were accessing our support centre. So we had to calculate days that they could come in, times that they could come in, workers that they could come in. If they're involved in the criminal justice system, they can't have the same support worker. It's tricky, and it does feel like firefighting. But just recently, it seems to have got, it has got harder and it has got worse, and we are all fighting over bits of money.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, commissioners are saying, we value partnership working and collaborations. But on the other hand, there isn't enough money to do it. It's
And do they understand the work? What I mean is any of that funding you obtaining and securing that funding, is it dependent on you fulfilling a set of criteria that they expect you to, whether that's approaches that you use or targets to meet, that actually just are completely inappropriate or irrelevant to the type of work you do and the people you work with? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And it is very frustrating.
Yeah.
There are, in an ideal world, we would just be, here's the money, you're the experts, go and do it. But I fully accept that there have to be KPIs and performance and outcomes and monitorings and stuff. I think my frustration is who uses the data and what for. What different? It's the so what factor. I will measure anything you want, but I want it to make a difference. Mm-hmm. I want it to influence strategy. So one of our local authorities, for example, and I'm not knocking anything about suicide or making little of it in any way, shape or form, but they have a suicide strategy, a suicide commissioner and team worker. And in this particular area, it was something like 30 people. Well, if I've had 1,500 people who've been raped and sexually abused, why haven't you got a strategy for that?
Yeah.
And it's that thing, I think, that sexual violence is just, we're still in the too difficult box. And people don't want to acknowledge it. The impact that we have, that sexual violence has on clients is, substance misuse, unhealthy coping strategies, eating disorders, self-injury, suicide attempts. It's not small stuff. Mm. And when you look at all of the other services, particularly mental health services, I think it's between 40 and 50% of inpatients have a history of sexual violence. Why aren't we looking at the root cause? Yeah. I think that's the thing I've never quite got my head around. Why are we always sticking plasters on it? And they're very small plasters, but sometimes are very ineffective on the wounds, the size that people are carrying around with them.
Mm. Thank heavens for people like you and all your colleagues that, across, I don't just mean in West Mercia, but across the board, rape crisis, Centre for Women's Justice, the large organisations and the small grassroots ones like yourselves that do this work, that are so passionate about it, because I don't know what else sometimes must keep it going other than your determination to be a voice for, to advocate for people that have been through an experience as incredibly impactful and traumatic as sexual violence.
I mean, the staff team that I have are absolutely brilliant and completely and utterly committed, because you do this because you believe in it and you want to make a difference and you want to change things for people. I mean, it's not for the money, because I think this is the third year we haven't been able to give a pay rise, and I don't know how we're hanging on to our staff. It's the fact that they are committed and brilliant, but you can only push that so far.
Yeah.
And that is mirrored pretty much, I think, across the sector. It's I was reading something about NSPCC and some of the others where they've got CEOs on massive £200,000 salaries. I'm thinking, God, that'd be great. But I know how many the amount of people that we could put through the service for that money, and you just think, yeah. And there is that thing you mentioned about giving survivors a voice, which is a huge privilege to be able to do. But not everybody wants to hear it.
Yeah.
One of the peculiarities of the sector is you have to do an annual report, and every year you have to sit down and write a blurb. And I'm desperately trying this year to be upbeat. as opposed to it's all hideous. We've got no money. What are we going to do? And we've got regrowth rates and everything like that. And oddly enough, I've been contacted by 3 clients recently that I worked with about 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's the other thing. We have longevity of staff in our organisation as well. And it's not all good. I mean, you work with a client as a counsellor. You want them to go on and do better things and to achieve and to be happy and whatever their goals look like, you want that for them. And not everything is that way. But I started to ask some of the staff team about, do you ever have feedback from clients? And one of them has had a dissertation dedicated to her.
Oh.
Periodically, clients will drop in and, or drop a text message. And there was one client who struggled with intimacy terribly, struggled with relationships. Because if your trust has been broken from a child in relationships, how do you navigate that? And she sent through pictures of her engagement, her marriage, and her first child. And you just think, isn't that amazing? And then you've got ones that are, one of my ex-clients is a GP, another one is a psychiatrist. We've got cabin crew, we've got police officers, we've got, all sorts of things. And some of the ones where particularly the children and young people, the power of the intervention that some of the staff have made are just incredible.
Mm.
And it's, I've had the courage to go back to university, and some of our ex-clients will come back and work for us, which is a huge testimony to, the difference that the service has made. And it's hanging on to those bits and thinking, what a legacy, what a difference.
And that's about the individuals you work with and the amazing work you do. But if I understand correctly, you're saying that the proof is in the pudding. Those whether they're small wins or whether they're bigger wins, that could also influence funding as well. It's not just look how awful things are and we need this money to help, but look at what that money can achieve. Can we go back a bit? Is that okay? Because I don't know how you even got into this type of work, Jocelyn. And I'm really conscious we've done today, what we usually do when we chat, and that sort of pretty much jump straight feet sort of first into it. And I'm really conscious that a lot of people listening to this, don't know you, aren't lucky enough to know you like I am. And so, it's wondering, would I be right that you first trained as a practitioner and then you would have ended up specialising working in this special field, or?
Yeah, it sounds a bit shallow when I talk about how I got into it. But it was, I'd worked a lot in finance.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely, and I worked for the local authority and absolutely hated my job with a passion. And for some reason, when they changed the pension age for women, I sat there like, I can't do this for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't know how I thought I could do it for 25 years, but I definitely couldn't do it for 30. And looked around, went back, retrained as a counsellor. And I sort of started looking around and thinking, well, there's 14 of us on this course who are all going to come out of counselling school together, and what's going to make me different and employable?
Yeah.
So I started working for the youth funding team, and went from, I did reparation orders and programmes and stuff. So I've painted school railings all around the county. Oh, it makes me shudder thinking of it sometimes. And then I did a training course with a sexual abuse organisation to go on their helpline. And one of my tutors actually said to me at the time, she said, the counselling work that you are supposed to do will find you. And I remember looking at her and going, yeah, right. What strange woman? Anywho, I did this this training course for sexual violence. And then I found that when I worked for the youth offending team, I was always the one that took disclosures from the kids. You know, you'd be driving along minding your own business with a paintbrush in the back, and there'd be a disclosure.
Yeah.
And then I worked for one of the colleges for a little while doing therapy there, and everything was sexual violence as well. And then I did my placement with, as it was, Worcestershire Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre. And it was just, I don't know, it was just one of those things. It is such interesting work. And it probably sounds a bit strange, but when you start looking at the dynamics and the processes and things that happen to people, it is absolutely fascinating. And then when I took over, there were two of us, and we had less than £2,000 in the bank. So,
Gosh.
Note to self, when you take over a charity, check the accounts first, which is what I didn't do.
How long ago was this? Early 2000s?
Yeah, 2004 I started. I did my placement 2002 and took over in 2004. And the previous CEO, or whatever we were called those days, was, oh yeah, it's fine, you'll get money easily. And I was not even going to cover my mortgage. Danger. So we just set about changing it and growing it, and I think our turnover is somewhere around about 3 million now.
Okay.
20 years later, and we did have 95 staff. We're back down to 86 now. We recently lost a contract, but it's no, we didn't lose it. We weren't awarded it, and there's a big difference there. I think that's the other thing that's happening in the sector, is that a lot of bigger organisations are moving in for local contracts.
I've heard that before. Yeah, I've heard that from other organisations we work with, perhaps in different areas. But they are saying that the bigger ones seem to be sort of fighting for those smaller, well, not fighting even necessarily, but...
Well, we can't compete against them.
Yeah,
there's the infrastructure that goes beyond them. And it just sort of grew, really. I do look at it sometimes and think, how did that happen then? What happened there? But we expanded from just having a very small counselling service. So I took the job on thinking I'd be doing counselling and a little bit of initial assessment, and everything else would be fine. I didn't realise the management, the fundraising, any of those elements, the safeguarding, talk about naive. But it was, it has been, I don't know, it's just changed. It's never been the same job. It's grown. So we had the first independent sexual violence advocate, which we thought we could just do. And we went from 2 staff to 3 staff, then to 4 staff, and then just boom, really.
And it's something, isn't it, when you talk about the number of staff that you have. I appreciate they're not all necessarily frontline, working with victim survivors, but even so, to have that many staff, and I know you always tell me that you have such a large waiting list sometimes. I'm just saying that to help people understand again of just the amount of work, the amount of people that are struggling with this in their lives and approaching services like yours. And still, with nearly 100 staff, that's really difficult to manage a lot of the time.
We had, I think it was about 3,500 new referrals last year.
Gosh.
See, when I first started off, I remember sitting in these hideous offices, and I sat down and I went, we've had 4 referrals this month. That's 1 a week. How busy are we? And then you go from that to like 3,500 and just think, oh.
So it's like 10 a day or so. I'm rubbish at maths, but yeah. Gosh.
Yeah, it is. Lots and lots of referrals. And people have different issues that go alongside them. But I think we've got 750 people on the waiting list for therapy. And we have cut we used to have open-ended, and we would have clients with us for maybe seven years. Then we had to cut all of that to 2 years. And then we've had to cut that to 24 weeks. And we're looking that we're going to have to cut it again. And it is difficult. I am very supportive of long-term therapy. I think for some people, it is, some of our clients, you could sit them in a room and with 4 different people, and they would be 4 different people to fit in with whoever's there. And sometimes the work is trying to find that sense of self. Well, who are you when you're not trying to please somebody else or not trying to fit in? And it's that bit that is I think the trickiest bit, especially if the abuse has started very, very young.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that about longer term therapy as well, although I suppose actually what I'm thinking of is a little different, but just how when things happen to us at such a young age, we need to by definition, keep revisiting and going through that story again and seeing it from that different perspective through the ages as we grow, don't we? So I would imagine by necessity people will then go back into doing some work, maybe not necessarily with the same service, but that's an ongoing journey, isn't it?
It is. And people will use other services, but we do have particularly children that come back at different life stages.
Yeah.
If you were sexually abused as a child and then you start to become sexually active, that's a whole different minefield. And it is, it's probably not proper counselling, ethical stuff, but it is so lovely to see them come back.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
How have you, how different are you and how have you moved on and what challenges have you got? And it is tricky. And some people have had the most horrific experiences, and you just think, well, how have you lived through it? And I think that is the strength of our client group in the survivors, is that you have lived through this already. And that's it may be difficult, but think what you've survived.
You're still here. Here you are. And here you are presenting yourself for support again. There's something in them that wants to survive, that wants to continue. Yeah, that's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's that sort of thing that keeps our team going in the face of ridiculous outcome measures, no money and all sorts of different stuff that goes along with it.
I know you presented with one of your colleagues at our conference. I can't remember if that was last year or 2 years ago. And gosh, yeah, it's age, isn't it, when time starts flying by like that. And I think some of the themes that you were talking about were, again, themes that just don't get acknowledged, don't necessarily get spoken about. You've already said today how sexual violence, it's still sat there in a box and that people don't necessarily like to open or even look at. And then you've got certain themes within that box that are perhaps even more so. So whether that's sibling abuse or whether that's children themselves being part of that, being perpetrators within that. And so I wonder if it's okay to just ask a little bit more about some of these more specialist areas that you particularly work in. I know some of that is intervention and prevention. Am I right? For young people, I mean.
We work within schools. We've lost quite a chunk of that contract recently to a very big provider. But when we have a couple of different programs. So again, you have these brilliant ideas and then you think, oh, how are we going to do that? I just thought the one day, and it was a Nelson Mandela quote that was, at some stage you've got to stop dragging the bodies from the river and go upriver and stop them jumping in.
Yeah.
Sexual violence is never going to stop unless we start making inroads. So we set up this early intervention and prevention work, and there is a huge growth on child abuse. But what actually happens? So unless there is a criminal justice case and that child goes to court and they're supported by the youth offending team or the youth support services, one of those teams, if there's no actual charge, there's no intervention. So we started working in that area, and it's not children as perpetrators, it's children who display harmful sexualized behavior. And there's problematic and there's harmful, and there's a whole scale. So if you're looking for information, Simon Hackett's work, there's a continuum of what is normal and what is problematic, and it's really well written. And it's that element of, well, where have you got this behaviour from? How is it manifesting? And within that cohort, so we were working with adults, then we started working with children. Then we realised that we weren't asking the right questions. So we started asking about, have you been harmed? Have you harmed?
Yeah.
And we started getting different answers. I mean, you ask the different question, you get the different answers. So we've got a whole cohort of children and young people who have both experienced sexual harm or abuse and have harmed others. And it's quite tricky trying to work out which bit comes first. So there is no causality. If anybody is abused as a child, there is no causality and no direct link for them going on to become abusers.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most frightening things for me is the impact of social media, online pornography, and access to materials that are not age appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't do social media in any way, shape or form, but the influences and the attitudes and some of the games that are being played, and when the team have worked with a lot of these children, they can pick up the information that they've been accessing. So I think it's Grand Theft Auto, where you can have sex with a prostitute.
Yeah.
And if you kill her, you don't have to pay her. Well, what is that doing to little minds? And there are all sorts of different links and causality of using pornography at an early age. And it's really quite worrying. And I don't think that consent is particularly being taught within schools terribly well. And, it's even things like pubic hair. The Brazilian cut came from the pornography industry. Because if there is hair, you can't get a good close-up angle. And we've got children shaving or stripping off all their pubic hair because that's what they see on screen.
Gosh.
And when you think about the origins of it, how does that ever work? How is that ever healthy?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the subtle differences. I was reading a report recently where the amount of increases in anal rape, because it is so commonplace on the internet. A lot of pornography now is very hardcore, and you can either watch people being raped or they can be simulated rape, and it can be with younger and younger people. And I mean, they say you're only ever 2 clicks away from pornography on the internet. I'm not sure it's even 2 anymore.
Yeah. I think a lot of the algorithms, aren't they, are just as soon as they recognise somebody is young, they start getting targeted with things.
Absolutely. And it's that element of how are we teaching and looking at respectful relationships and consent and, that whole power and control concept. There's always the influencers like Andrew Tate, but the messages that he gives out. I was reading recently, and I must admit I did think it was a joke, that there was a school that were including in their sex education how to safely strangle your partner.
Choke. Yeah, I read that too.
I genuinely thought this has got to be a joke, because surely this would not be allowed, and then you followed it through and it was genuine.
Yeah.
Well, should we stop and look at the impact that might have on somebody, that somebody passes out, that there's, the brain is starved of oxygen, that there are body, just what is going on? How could anybody know? Strangulation, bad. Choking, bad. No, don't do it. Let's not be glamorizing it and saying, oh, this is all part of fun. And it is that misogynistic approach that I find, and the rise of that I find quite worrying.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, Jocelyn, because on my very long list of different themes and questions and subjects that I'd written down to perhaps bring into our conversation today, that was one of them. Whether you feel, because it's easy, isn't it, for somebody like me that doesn't necessarily specialise in the field that you work in, but try and stay informed as much as I can. But again, you never know what you're reading, the truth of it, or whether it's being exaggerated or whatever. But of course, you've mentioned his name. This very popular, seemingly popular man amongst lots of young men and boys that seems to have been part of, at least. I don't want to give him too much recognition or importance. Yeah, be a voice for this, what we see as a rise in misogyny. And I did wonder whether that is something that you feel is very much, you are seeing that actually manifest in the people that you support and help, or in the young people that you're speaking to. And it sounds like you're saying absolutely it is. This isn't just something that the internet is, over exaggerating. That's sad and scary to hear.
It is. I mean, there's been a big fuss recently made about the programme Adolescence.
Yeah.
Which I did watch. And I thought it was a brilliant piece of drama and acting, and there were themes in there. But there's been talk of it being used as a resource in schools.
Schools, that's right.
No. No. I mean, there has to be context. And, absolutely brilliant piece of drama. But unless you have got teachers, and I think so much is expected of teachers, but like you said, unless you actually work in sexual violence, how do you unpick that? How do you unpick the dynamics? And like there's the last episode where they're saying about he goes to the shop, and the anger and the tension in that family are never mentioned. There are indicators there, you think, well, what's that about and how's that about? And there were some brilliant parts in it, but not to be used in schools. Not without, you could use clips. You could have a discussion point about it, but children need to have the context of, well, what would cause this? What would you do in this situation? How would that come through? Why do you think it's a bad thing? Where does that rage and anger come from? And the bit that in Adolescence for me is that the girl that was the murder victim, her and her family were rarely mentioned. Well, what happened to them? How do they carry on with a life where that's happened to their child? And there was, for me, a victim blaming element where they were saying that, well, she was bullying him, like that's an excuse. And some of the online responses were very much along the lines of, well, she shouldn't have bullied him, she had it coming. When you start going down victim blaming elements of that, unless there is somebody there that can challenge that effectively and pull it out and say, well, what do you think about this, and discuss it, it's not, I would say it's not safe. And what about those kids, if it's being shown in assembly, that this is impacted on? What about those kids that are living that life? What about the ones that are scared or traumatized or triggered by being that assembly? Where's the support that goes around them?
Again, I'm thinking of conversations that you and I have had in the past about how you've tried to take some of your work into schools and some of the resistance you've come up against. Not necessarily from school, sometimes that will be from parents, where people are still find it so difficult, let's face it, to talk about healthy sex sometimes, never mind things like sexual violence or abuse. And you mentioned earlier about consent, for example, and how well that's being taught in schools. I don't know if you have an answer to this, so please feel free to just say this is something I don't know enough about. But I do wonder if you have any awareness of where schools are at in education around this. Just more generally, at the moment in the curriculum or schools around you that you've had contact with, because it just feels like you're so right. We can't put everything on teachers, but at the same time, it does feel very much like education. Good education around so much of this would be so important.
Yeah, I think, or our experience is that it varies from school to school.
Okay.
And some schools will welcome you with open arms and have conversations. Some schools will be, we've got this particular group of children that we want you to work with. We always offer to put on a parents' session, very rarely taken up. Because people, and I get why people don't want to talk about sexual violence, because if you do, you don't want to think that it could happen to anybody that you know or love. Mm. You certainly don't want it to happen to your child, and you don't want to acknowledge that the people that you know, some of them are perpetrators. Mm. I mean, the latest chief police officer's report, they reckon that 1 in 20 people is a perpetrator. So we're talking huge numbers. But different schools are different. We did have a particular Catholic school that invited us in, but then said we couldn't use the word sex. So that did make things a little tricky.
Is there an alternative word you were encouraged to use?
I think the team just carried on with their normal session and went, "Oh, sorry," at the end. Some of this is going to sound, I don't mean it to sound judgmental, but some of the best schools that we have worked with are the schools that acknowledge and are aware that they have problems.
Yeah, I understand.
So a lot of the pupil referral units, a lot of the schools with additional needs, a lot of the ones that are perhaps on the more deprived estates. Mm-hmm. And where we tend to find a fair bit of resistance is from schools who are very, very concerned about their image and their profile. And, doesn't happen in our class.
Yeah, I was going to say, so actually you're talking about almost a denial in that sense on their part. Doesn't
complete and utter.
Fair enough.
Complete and utter denial, yeah.
I'm trying to say it a little bit more gently, but yeah, no, okay, yeah, fair enough. So that said, it doesn't happen amongst our community or our pupils, and therefore we don't need to talk about it.
And it is, some of the work that we've done is and also working in schools, some of the attitudes within the schools. So we worked with one school where they were saying that they were measuring skirt lengths. And one of the comments was, the girls wear skirts so short it distracts the male teachers.
The male teachers?
Oh, so where do you even start with that? And it's, we've been in sessions, the team have been in sessions, and one of the teachers, again a male teacher, turned around and said, "Oh, you're just going to be in here saying about how it's all men and, it's never a woman's fault. Or do you think anybody deserves to be raped?" And it's some of the attitudes in the teaching staff are quite interesting, which is why I think it's best that things like sexual abuse and domestic abuse training and in interventions in schools is best done by subject matter experts.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's us or somebody else, but, where you can have that conversation and challenge it and, for a male teacher to say, oh, it's just going to think you think all men are rapists. I went to a funding meeting the other week, and a man turned around to me, the problem with you is you think all men are rapists. I thought, well, hello. Did you want a cup of tea? You could see he was boiling and just had to blurt it out. It's an interesting viewpoint. But it is tricky, and schools vary from school to school, and also the way that they respond to child-on-child abuse. Some schools are brilliant, some are not.
Yeah.
And there is guidance out there now, which is a huge, huge thing. But if you have got two pupils and one rapes the other, why would you be putting the child that was raped into isolation? And what message are you giving to the child, the survivor, and the child that's raped them?
Yeah.
And what are you giving to the whole cohort around them? And because that's the other thing, social media, it's wildfire, isn't it? You know, the way that news spreads and things spread through schools is absolutely, I'm so glad I grew up before mobile phones.
But Jocelyn, but oddly, I mean, me too, goodness me. I mean, yeah. But actually, when I think back to my time at school, which is a very long time ago, stuff still spread like wildfire then. And if you imagine that in a world of social media, I mean, it must be sometimes within seconds, within minutes, something's out there. Yeah. We started our conversation earlier by joking about how sometimes counsellors can be the worst at being pandered with time. But I am very conscious of time, and I would there's so many other things that I wish we could talk about. So maybe we're going to have to do a sequel to this. But to sort of end on something more positive, something I always want to ask guests, but very rarely get the chance to because time runs away with us, is how you look after yourself away from work. And I think I am purposely finding the time to ask you that because of the type of work you are involved in, and because you joked earlier about all the meetings you are in, but I'm actually really conscious that in those meetings you are very often the voice saying the things that people don't want to listen to. You are, again, I said earlier, you are the advocate and the voice of the people you are supporting. And that must take it out of you, Jocelyn. So what do you do outside of work to just decompress, bring yourself down a bit and breathe?
I am not always the best, I have to be honest.
That's okay.
I do try, and I do try very, very well. I think the things that I do the most is that I have a fabulous, fabulous husband who is very good at stop now. Stop. Because it's that thing, isn't it, that your brain just whirs and carries on. And even after you've finished and you sat there thinking about, I went to have a hearing test, and the woman said, "Why are you here?" And I said, well, it's either that I can't hear my husband or I'm just filtering him out. And after the test, she said, "You're filtering?" Oh, and it's because it's so busy in your head and you're thinking different things. Yoga.
Okay.
I have to concentrate really, really hard on standing up.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've got one foot off the floor, I cannot think about anything else. And it is that whole breathing thing, which, I do sit in a lot of meetings. And when I've stuck my hand up again and you can see the collective eye roll, oh God, she's here again. It's that breathing element of, all right, let's just take a little pause and have a breathe and bring it down a little bit and then rant in a different way.
Yeah.
So there's the yoga. I have a dog.
I was going to mention your dog.
He's my first ever pet, apart from a goldfish. And we go off and we do a lot of thinking in the woods.
Oh.
And wandering around different woods. So there is that. There is obviously Pinot Grigio, which is a very helpful aid to winding down. And I have a camper van. So I think for me, the biggest thing is outside and away. And if you are away from home, so I work from home, which has changed, in the whole COVID thing with the dynamic changed. I've never really gone away. And my office now that I used to have has got 3 different people in it. So I haven't got a confidential space. So I work probably 95% from home. Mm-hmm. And that changes the dynamic because there's no hour-long drive home or hour-long drive to process and wind down. And I do miss that. So I tend, when I've finished work, to just take the dog out for a little walk round. I'm not sure either of us are particularly safe on the roads. If I'm not fully concentrated.
With your mind elsewhere. Yeah, I understand. But you're still walking it out, aren't you? And getting that space.
Yeah, it's that change. You're rushing all the time and rushing in deadlines. And, I take him out for a walk. And by the time he stopped and sniffed his 5th dandelion, you're just there going, all right, let's calm down. You take your time, mate. And he's just there and he's going, I'll just have that daffodil over there.
Oh.
And watching him, and I think it's the wonder that he finds in things prevents over-jadedness in me.
That's really, and you've almost covered all the bases there, haven't you? You've got everything from the breathing to sort of animal therapy to somatic therapy, with your yoga and walking. So actually, and nature, being out in the woods, going away in your camper van, all those things actually that we do know are so helpful and are so nurturing and nourishing. And like you say, it's just remembering to do them or having the energy to do them. I know sometimes many of us in this profession have to sort of force ourselves to do these things, don't we? But it is so important. I think we talk a lot about with the people we work with. We talk a lot about transitions, don't we? But actually, there's transitions, from one client to another, from one room to another, from being in bed to going into our working day and coming out of our working day into our evenings, and all these little tiny transitions we do on a daily basis. And I think anything we can do to sort of be mindful of each of those tiny transitions is really helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was going to say, the one I missed off is I've learned to knit.
Oh, really? You've become a knitter?
Right, I'm a starting knitter.
Okay.
Not necessarily a completer finisher. But there is something that I particularly like, the variegated wool where it changes colour as you're going.
Yeah. And
there is something about the colour. And I mean, my spare room, I've got so much wool in there. There's probably a flock of sheep have donated for this spare room. But it's the repetitive. And I'm not good enough to, my sister-in-law just knits and doesn't even look at it.
Flicks away, yeah.
I am still the poke through, right, move on to the next stitch. And the levels of concentration it takes. And then the wool changes colour. And it's all just knit a little bit more to get to the next colour change. So we've got a lot of blankets in our house.
I was going to ask, how many half-finished items do you have?
I've got about 7.
Oh.
I think, at a rough guess. And it's that thing of I like the buying and I like the pattern choosing and I like the starting, and then it just gets a bit dull after that.
Oh, listen, thank you so much for your time today. And there are so many, especially very counselling sort of specific and related questions that I was going to ask actually. But yeah, maybe that's for another day. It's just great to hear about your work more generally and actually where it is now, because again, we do need to be mindful that, you know, many of our members will be seeing people coming into their rooms, you know, that have had some of these experiences. It's one of the, you know, most common questions we get asked about, and I'm sure supervisors do too. So yeah, I know it's such a big subject, but I think probably the main thing is just to thank you and the team for all the work you do, and for being such a great ambassador for us too about this work and speaking about it so openly. So thank you. Thank you so much to Jocelyn for finding the time to talk to us today, and thank you for listening in. For links to learn more about Jocelyn's work and also to some recommended resources can be found in the show notes below. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.